even those fuels are not 100% carbon neutral, because energy has to be created some way. And we think that regardless how clean and sustainable and more available and more affordable it becomes, it will still not be free. We also feel that there is a lot of ambiguity around what future legislation will mandate and what technology will actually be available. I mean, some of the technology that we look at as revolutionary today might actually be considered quite obsolete in 10 years' time. And the future solutions might not even be on our radar, right? And the final point kind of in this challenge is that in our quest for carbon neutrality, we shouldn't forget the more holistic and broader environmental impacts of the choices we make, right? So it's not all about carbon. Carbon is important, but you have other air particles issues. You have the NOx in your SOx, you have soot, you have the impacts we have on the marine ecosystem, and then you have the full chain and the environmental footprint of the energy sources we use. So really want to highlight some of the things that is not related to the hardware necessarily. Really want to point out some low-hanging fruits and some things we can do today, and things that doesn't necessarily require much investment, but rather closer collaboration. So Craig, if you can move on to the next slide, that would be great. So we want to highlight some ideas that we, from a marine service provider and really being involved with the port, as Inchcape, we have offices in literally all the major ports in the world, and we do business, we do something with most of our customers. We feel we have a fairly good grasp of all the different segments and the different challenges in different geographies and so on. But let's start with something very simple, very tangible, right? You want to decarbonize, and that means using as little energy as possible in getting from A to B. Well, let's start with something simple. Make sure we choose the most efficient, safe route, and we execute on that. We make sure that we have a clean hull and that we have fit for purpose equipment. The worst thing we can do is having tonnage which is not fully utilized, and you're carrying half-empty ships around the world. That doesn't do anyone good. And then we get into something which we are very passionate about, and that is the timely and relevant information. So in order to do the most efficient, safe route execution, you need the appropriate information, and you need it at the right time. Then we get to the actual arrival of the ship in port. And I think the phrase just-in-time arrival is something that's generating a little bit of buzz now. And I think that is something we really need to focus on. But I also think it's worth bearing in mind that it's not always just in time. It's actually about the right time of arrival, because just in time in one port might be too late or too soon for the subsequent port call. And the whole point here is idling and wasting time is also wasted energy, and hence increases your environmental footprint. When we get to the to establishing this right time of arrival, one of the big challenges is you need to coordinate across a myriad of stakeholders and parties who quite often will have conflicting interests. And at the moment, there isn't really an efficient way of sharing information across a neutral platform. So sharing information and removing the potential conflict of interest, and hence allowing a better planning and make sure that you actually arrive at the port in the right time, and so you don't have to rush. Once in port, it's then really important to optimize the actual port call. So we all know that ships doesn't really make money while they're in port, and they certainly don't make money when they're idling. And of course, there are exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking. And again, the access of information is crucial to start planning this. So you might think you've timed it just in time and you arrived just in time, but then tugs aren't available, or the pilot isn't available, or there isn't a berthing window for you. And you need to really bring together all the pieces of information and bring that into consideration quite early in your voyage planning and your route execution. While in port, it's not only about the cargo, it's much more. There are a number of activities that needs to take place relating to a ship's port call, which also needs planning to avoid wasting time or having an extended port stay, or having to rush to arrive earlier. And we all know things like it's provisions, it's bunker, it's crew changes, it's maintenance, it's hull cleaning, and so on. And then one thing that I feel is very little talked about in the broader maritime industry at the moment, but which is certainly gathering a lot of interest in Scandinavia and maybe Norway in particular, and that's the option of cold ironing. So actually connecting to shore power. I think maybe the effect on the actual carbon emission might be fairly limited, but it'll have a massive positive effect on particle pollution in the near environment of the port. And then finally, this is all about end-to-end voyage optimization. You cannot look at one port call in isolation, because the voyage always starts with the previous port of call and it continues to the next port of call. So your right time of arrival in one port might mean that you're late or early for the next port call. So it's really about looking at this holistically and trying to bring together the relevant information. If we then go to next slide, Craig, I'll soon be finished. So it's a little bit of call to action from our side. Let's not wait for this revolutionary new way of propelling our ships. That'll come, and we'll work on that. But right now, there are some very tangible actions we can take to have a more optimized port call and a better end-to-end voyage execution. Really, keep it simple, stupid. We have to start with some of the low-hanging fruits. And a lot about that is actually coordinating with the port authorities, the agents, the suppliers, and the different cargo interests. We have to find ways of share information and communicate. We see far too much silo thinking. We see far too much, we are not willing to share this information because we think it's a competitive advantage if we keep it secret. And I think we should learn to collaborate across ship owners, across ports, across agents, across different shipping segments. There are some really best-in-class examples of how you can create the most effective end-to-end route and actually plan really, really far ahead. Look at the liners, container liners or car carriers. Look at the cruise ships. You can ask a cruise ship, where will you be on the 15th of May 2 years from now, and they can tell you. And the berth will probably already be booked. It's about regulations and contracting. As a person, I'm probably not the biggest fan of over-regulating, but there are certain aspects here that shouldn't be left as optional. It should be it should be a mandate that you have to follow. Contracting is supremely important here, and I really look forward to hearing BIMCO talk about this, because if you have a contracting process or a contract methodology which avoids secrecy and rushing and basically trying to manipulate the time of arrival, then that's contradictory to really having the most efficient port call execution. I think we should include penalties and incentives. We should penalize the worst in class, and we should really incentivize the right type of behavior. And this goes across the whole maritime value chain. So whether it be a port or a ship owner or an agent or a tug operator, it doesn't matter. And then it's about the facilities. And I know Ben will talk about this, but how do we ensure that the facilities are fit for purpose, that the suppliers and the service providers are included in this big giant puzzle? because if everything goes well, but your bunker stem isn't ready, then you will still have delays and you will still have a suboptimal execution of the port call. And as I said earlier, the port call will then affect the next part of the sea voyage, right? And I think it's important, and particularly for the ship owners and operators, is to make it count to the end user. So we can see that this, I think, like with most environmental initiatives, they come at a price, but you can make it back, because if you make it count to the end customer, whether that be a consumer or a cargo, a commodity trader, or your investors, your shareholders. And I put ESG here in brackets. It's not really ESG. It's about an environment, right? But everybody talks about ESG, so it tends to resonate. But if you're demonstrating that you're operating in an environment-friendly and sustainable way, you should be able to attract a premium. It should literally affect your share price. It should literally affect the decision-making of the shippers. They should choose your ships rather than someone operating in a suboptimal manner. So that is all I had. Really looking forward to hearing the other panelists speak, and then I'm sure we'll have a good roundtable discussion at the end. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much, Frank. Going to move quickly now on, as Frank mentioned, to Ben van Scherpenzeel, who's chairman of the International Task Force on Port Call Optimization, of which Inchcape is one of the founding members. He's also Director of Nautical Development of Policy Plans at the Port of Rotterdam. So, Ben, over to you, please.
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, indeed, as Frank already said, this is really about collaboration in the entire business process. And then it does help if in a port community, we all agree that we are looking at and trying to improve the same business process. So what we did together with 10 other ports and the 6 major carriers and their agents, including Inchcape, we drafted a business process that is port and trade agnostic. So it represents tanker, container, bulker trade, and it is applicable to every port because it is based on existing IMO regulations, clauses, and BIMCO contracts, and representing also authorities like customs, immigration, etc. So it starts from the moment the ship is being chartered. The deal is closed with the cargo buyer, the cargo seller. Indeed, the voyage planning up from berth to berth, and the whole operational aspect inside the port area. Next one, please. And based on that business process, we, of course, identified first as a port authority what are the direct responsibilities for us as a port authority. Next one, please. And based on feedback of the subject matter experts from shipping lines and ports, we have identified the different information blocks for which we as a port authority are directly responsible and which information should be up and running, real-time access, etc. And focus on these responsibilities first to make them 100% correct in line with International Hydrographic Organization standards, the International Maritime Organization, make them accessible through APIs, etc. Next one, please. And second, focus on indirect responsibilities of the port authorities. So those are responsibilities that are not directly ours, but do have an effect on the port call of our end customer. Next one, please. So for example, this is about berth information. So typically, we as a port provide information from part of boarding place to berth, but only the terminal can provide the specs of the terminal, such as a manifold diameter or the container crane height, that kind of specifications that are only known to the terminal. But it does affect the port call if also that piece of information is not correct. Typically also the berth planning is not the responsibility of a port. So most ports have private terminals, and those terminals are responsible for their own berth planning, but it does affect the port call if that berth planning is not transparent. Same applies to ISPS clearance of the terminal gate or the service planning of bunkers, provisions, garbage, etc., like Frank already mentioned. So altogether, and indeed, it is collaboration in the port community between agents, terminals, and the port authority, the service providers, the other authorities like customs and immigration to make it all work. And indeed, data transparency is the oil in the machine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that input. Let me just move the slides on. I think we'll hear next from Andreas Jorgen from Dorm. Andreas, over to you, please.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you, Ben and Frank as well. So just to start with, Tom also have been accepted into ITPCO, the task force that Frank is leading, and that came through a dialogue with Inkscape. So in my talks with Inkscape, where we have a contract, I heard about ITPCO and I was hooked up with Ben, and then a few months later, then we were part of the task force, right? So I think a point here is that through collaboration, through dialogue, then new opportunities arise, because for sure within Tom that have inspired us. So thanks for that. So Craig, let's jump to the next slide. So just for you to get a glimpse into where this is on a ship owner's strategic canvas. So we operate a fleet of around 80 vessels in the tramp business, own and operate. And recently in Tom we put green on this strategic roadmap. So we have this element of towards a greener future, which is not unlike what a lot of other competitors out there are doing. So I think we have a lot of companies that now start to evolve around the greener future, which also is promising to see where we are aligning. Next one. Here now, what we're doing as a ship owner, we are focusing on the voyage optimization, the behavioral optimization, and technology improvements. So that's some of the things that both will give us advantages on reducing GHG, and also very often goes hand in hand with return to the shareholders. So I think there are many synergies between decarbonizing and also sound for the business, but you of course have to identify those synergies. But we are doing a lot of things here now. We have done a lot of things over the past years. We have had a fleet renewal, which in itself also drives down on the emissions. Great, next one. So on the mid to long term view, we've set some targets, not unlike others in the industry, that by 2030 we'll reduce our CO2 reductions by 40% in comparison with the 2008 numbers, and by 2050 we're going to be CO2 neutral. So there are elements we can do here now towards 2030. We can continue to reduce our consumption on the vessels. We can develop more fuel efficient ship designs, also on existing, but also on new vessels. And we can embrace new technology. When it sort of comes to the next step into the long-term future, it is a higher step that we have to take, and it requires more cooperation across the industry, is our view, and it also requires more cooperation and influencing on decision makers. I think there's a lot of forums out there already and groups. One has mentioned ITPCO, also others that are coming together about the greener future, and we are joining those where we feel it makes relevance for us and where we can be heard and part of making a change. Great, next one. And if we then take it to the port call specifically, I think just to put it in context, in the tramp business, we call around 100 different countries a year, more than 400 different ports in the world, and some 2,000 to 3,000 port calls. So also to align around that with the number of different stakeholders that you have in a port call is sort of a large number of entities and companies that needs to come together, right? So that's just how it is for companies like ours that are in the tramp business. So there it is also of an essence that there's standardization taking place. But of course, if we can reduce the time in port, we'll also reduce the GSG output in port. As I mentioned, the collaboration is important, in particular during a port call. On the seagoing voyage, there are less stakeholders that we need to involve in order to make a change. One of the biggest stakeholders is our customers. Transparency, I think we all need to be more transparent, and we also have the abilities to be more transparent as we drive the efficiency through the use of data. A lot of companies are using data a lot more now on the efficiency, and I think that's one place at least where it would be relatively easy to be more transparent and also share best practices. Create synergies with our customers. I think that's important for us. I mean, in our dialogue with our customers and ultimately their end users, as mentioned previously, we need to figure out where we have the synergies. Just-in-time arrival, I believe, can be a synergy for the ship owner as well as our customers. We just have to find the right way to get it started, and that hasn't really sufficiently started yet, in my view, in the tramp business. I know Grant will come back on that. And then the industry needs to reach a maturity where GSG is adding significant value to the business model. I think our clients, they admire what we do. Will they pay more for it here now? Necessarily not. Will we jeopardize the value for our shareholders? Not necessarily. So we have to find when is that maturity where this has a high value, and that's not necessarily something that can only be driven through a ship owner and the customer. And then, of course, we'll continue to drive onboard efficiency during the port call. So that's some of the main points around the port call. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you very much. And I'll move straight on then to Grant Hunter, Head of Contracts Clauses at BIMCO, for some of those key elements that Frank was alluding to in his presentation. So Grant, over to you, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Craig. If I could move slides. We've just gone to the next one as well. And I'm going to talk to you about the contractual dimension of just-in-time. It's a small, but I think a very important part of finding a just-in-time solution that we get what goes into contracts correct. And I think Frank Olsen actually hit it right on the nail right at the very beginning of this discussion here. Talking about the philosophy of keeping it simple. I think it is really, really important not to try to over-regulate what we put into contracts and clauses. We need flexibility. We need the parties to the contract, and there are only two parties. It's the owners and the charterers and a charter party here. and they've not got to think of themselves just contracting partners for business purposes. It's almost got to be like a partnership and a collaboration for this to work. And the examples that we have seen in the industry where people have been able to implement just-in-time arrival procedures, and certainly the tanker sector, it has been very much through this partnership arrangement and really sitting down and talking and working out this solution. It's not just the case that somehow a clause will appear in a charter party and then it will all work out fine. I think it goes a little bit beyond that. Now, our aims in developing a clause for the bulk sector, for tankers and dry bulk as well, obviously the main aims are just in time, improving ship import efficiency, reducing carbon emissions from ships, reducing the emissions that come from ships when they're in ports, reducing congestion in ports. We see lots of these benefits that come from just in time arrivals, and reducing this waiting time that we see and the inefficiencies that are in our shipping industry. For this to work, we do need to incentivize owners and charterers. There needs to be something in their contract that says, yes, this is worth our while doing. So we need to sit down and think about what those incentives may be. And of course, the obvious one is, for adjusting the speed of the vessel. There are the fuel savings for the charterer. There may be savings on demurrages payments as well. So there may be things that the parties can readily identify and be incentives. But it could also be that ports themselves, I think, have been mentioned earlier on. The ports could introduce incentives for parties are prepared to implement a just-in-time arrivals procedure over those who don't. So again, we need to think about, as an industry, how do we really kind of push this forward and roll it out and get more and more people to use it. Creating the benefits, we've talked briefly about those. Some other benefits that might sort of be thrown out from this, I've put in here time pressure and hull fouling. I'm not suggesting hull fouling is a benefit. What I'm suggesting is that if you arrive just in time, is that you're not sitting around at anchor where hull fouling will occur. Your ship is moving all the time, and therefore your hull coating will hopefully minimize the need to clean on a more frequent basis. So there's benefits there. Time pressure as well. There is time pressure on crews. Sometimes it's self-imposed, but we have this mentality in the industry where you're rushing to get to your next port as fast as you possibly can, and that clearly does sometimes place pressures on crews. The counter argument to that, of course, is that if you arrive as fast as you possibly get to port and have a few days in anchor, then maybe your crew can relax a little bit, but invariably they'd be tied up doing maintenance or whatever. So that kind of works on both sides. We need to think about the different aspects and different benefits that we might see from using this scheme. If I could have the next slide, please. So our objectives, again, keeping it simple, just something you can put into a charter party that's going to be reliable and it's going to be easy to use, and people can readily understand. I mean, what we're very much against at BIMCO, we're a practical organisation trying to come up with practical solutions. So if we write something that's far too legalistic, you have to rush off and ask your lawyer how it actually works, we failed in our ambition. We want to keep it very simple, very practical, and as commercial as possible. We want to address the main issues in using and implementing a just-in-time scheme, and we want to fairly allocate the risks and responsibilities in a fair way between the parties. This isn't just about sort of making it fairer for owners. We need to look to see what's in it for charters as well, and make a fair allocation of responsibilities and liabilities so that it works for both of them, so that the incentive comes through there as well, but they clearly understand what it is they're getting into contractually before they go down this road. And of course, it has to be broadly applied. We want the clause that we've produced here to actually work across all sectors in the bulk industry, and I mean by bulk not just dry bulk but tankers as well. I've been criticised recently for saying just the word bulk and excluding tankers, but I do mean tankers here, so it's bulk in the broadest possible sense. We've seen a good amount of success with just-in-time arrival solutions working in the container and the liner sector, not so much so in the bulk sector yet, so I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but this clause is here designed to sort of help in that process contractually. Next slide, please. So we have produced two clauses, in actual fact. The first does deal specifically with just-in-time arrival, and I'll come on to that in a second. But we've also got a second clause that we haven't yet released, will be coming out very shortly. And it deals with this, what has been touched upon by other speakers as well. The need to exchange information. And we've got to decide as an industry to move forward and have a common platform that ships moving around the world don't have to deliver information in different formats. I mean, that doesn't help anyone at all. We need to freely exchange information. We need to have common platforms so we can collaborate. And this, I'll come on to that later about what exactly that has in there. It's a very simple clause, but it does encourage, a common platform. As far as these clauses are used, you can use them both together or independently. It may not be that you're able to implement a just-in-time arrival scheme in your particular trade, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't also be able to use a platform for exchanging information in a common way. So they can be used independently or both together. Next slide, please. So a big question, why do we actually need a clause in a charter party at all? Why can't we just adjust the speed of our arrival to suit the parties? Well, the fact is the way that voyage charter parties are constructed, the owners are under a very strict obligation to get their ship as fast but as safely as they can in between ports. So the safety aspect is very keen, and I'm keen to emphasize that part as well, but a ship owner must prosecute these voyages as quickly as they possibly can within the safety regime. And that's what we call a due dispatch obligation. It's a strange term of phrase, whatever, but you will see it in most voyage charter parties. And it's an obligation not only towards the charterer, but if there is cargo on board, then that obligation is also passed on to third-party bill of lading holders, those who own the cargo as well. So if you as a ship owner decide on your route from, say, the United States over to Rotterdam or whatever, I can call in quickly somewhere and buy some cheap bunkers or whatever, or pick up some spare parts or do a crew change or whatever. Unless you're expressly allowed to do that under the voyage charter party, that will be called a deviation, and it's an unjustified deviation. The consequences for the ship owner, if he's got cargo on board and he does one of these unjustified deviations, which the charter party doesn't allow him to do, if something happens to that cargo, then it's quite possible that he may prejudice his P&I cover. So the insurance cover for the cargo may be lost, may not apply. So that's quite a serious position for a ship owner to find himself in. So we need to put safeguards into the contract to say that as far as just-in-time arrival is concerned, yes, you are allowed to adjust your speed and not rely on this utmost or due dispatch obligation in the contract, and you will be protected against doing that. So it's very, very important we safeguard the owner's position in respect to this normal strict obligation by having other wording in the contract to deal with that. We also have the issue of the cancellation date. A ship needs to arrive at a port by a certain date, after which the charter would have the right to cancel that voyage, cancel that ship. So in agreeing to adjust the arrival date of a ship, you also need a sort of a counter wording in the contract as well that says, okay, I agree to just the speed, but if it now is going to mean that I'm bumping up against this cancellation date, then the charterer needs to agree with me that we can move that cancellation date back so we've got more time to arrive. Because it would be a complete commercial nonsense if you agree to adjust your speed and then you arrive the day after the cancellation date and the charter says, sorry, you're cancelled. That wouldn't work at all. We need some contractual infrastructure in there to safeguard the owner's position in terms of the cancellation date. Now, this is something that's not necessarily easily done. It sounds like, oh, fine, the charterer can just say we move the date. The charterer will be subject to underlying sales contracts for the cargoes as well, and where there will also be a cancelling date. So again, we need this collaboration and cooperation and communication to make sure that this is all sort of back-to-back in contracts down the line to make sure we are able to move cancellation dates so that we can benefit from just-in-time arrival. Next slide, please. So how do we implement it contractually? So we have written what I think is a fairly short clause by the BIMCO standard sometimes, but it's fairly very much to the point. I'm not going to show you the clause. I'm sure you don't necessarily need to see the wording as well, but I'll just touch upon some of the key components that it has. And I think the very first part of the clause just echoes what's been said by several other speakers already. It's this need to share information, firstly between the owner and the charterer, because they are parties to the contract, but to all the other stakeholders as well. We need to get as much information between the parties here that we know that this is actually going to work. So there's an aspect of sharing information and collaborating on information to make sure that we can actually arrive at this adjusted time. So that would obviously include the agents and the port and the terminal as well, and also delivering that information in whatever requirement, whatever platform is required for that. So the whole concept of information is absolutely foremost here in sharing information. We then get onto the aspect of what rights would the charterer actually have to adjust the speed. And so what we say under a voyage charter party is that the charterer would have the right to ask or request the owner to adjust the ship's speed. But it is nevertheless still with the ship owner itself to decide whether that's possible within the ship's capabilities, within the prevailing conditions or whatever. The ship owner is certainly not expected that the ship should exceed its capabilities in any way or prejudice its operational limits. So it's a discussion between owner and charter to agree that it is possible to adjust the speed of the vessel. Now, we're talking about adjustment. This is not a slow steaming clause. We're not just generally reducing the speed of the vessel. We are adjusting the speed of the vessel over a portion of the voyage. And that may entail, perhaps if it hits a little bit of weather, you might need to speed back up again to try to reach that agreed arrival time. So the contract would essentially say you'll do your best to arrive as close as possible to that agreed arrival time. There are no 100% guarantees that's possible, but it's an adjustment of speed. It's not just slow speeding. We then look upon the issue of the cancelling date as well. As I mentioned before, it's very, very important that we address this issue. If the charterer has asked for the vessel to arrive at a new arrival time, and that's very close to the cancelling date in the voyage charter party, then it's only fair that the owner say, well, okay, well, I need a bit more of a buffer. I need that cancelling date to be pushed back a couple of days, or at least, give me 1 day more than I'm agreeing to arrive at the moment. So we need to have that agreement in place. The part and parcel of agreeing to adjust the speed is this change in cancelling date if necessary. We'll then move on to the next aspect of the benefits. And we've talked a long time and gone into a lot of detail about, do we create some sort of benefit scheme within the charter party itself, or how do we share these particular benefits, in terms of bunker savings, time savings, demurrage savings, or whatever. And I think it's important not to try to over-regulate or try to prescribe to the industry how this might be done. I think we need to flag up that there needs to be a discussion about benefit sharing, but we also need to recognise that the owner will certainly make savings in fuel, so he's already got something in his pocket. How is that shared? How are the benefits shared? That needs to be left to the commercial parties to agree upon. So when they're doing the negotiations, I say it's a partnership, it's a collaboration. They need to sit down and work out what works best for them as a sharing of the benefits. It's not for us to dictate what that might be. So we put a very simple mechanism in there, but what we fully expect the parties to do is to come up what works for them commercially. And I think that's the best way in terms of having a flexible commercial agreement for that. We then move on to, how we should perhaps overcome the just-in-time or the greatest obstacle, the fact that you've got to exercise this due dispatch. So we need to have clear wording in the clause to say that if you deviate in order, which is effectively slowing down or adjusting your speed, then it doesn't prejudice whatever else in the charter party there. You're not going to be held liable for deviating or slowing down or breaching your utmost dispatch obligation. So we need clear wording in there that safeguards the owner because he's adjusting his speed. So that's included in the clause as well. And then ultimately, of course, we do need some indemnities in place if, as a result of following charterers' instructions and agreeing to slow down the vessel, there is nevertheless some claim from a third-party bill of lading holder or whatever, then the charterer needs to agree to indemnify the owner from any of those consequences there. So that's the clause essentially in a nutshell. That's how it's designed to function. It's kept very, very simple and straightforward. If I could have the next slide, please. And then finally, the clause I mentioned, a very simple clause, which we've called the BIMCO Port Call Data Exchange Clause. And this is BIMCO really just standing behind the IMO's initiative to come up with a global framework for how we exchange information between ports and ships and other stakeholders in there. They've come up with a data model framework. We would certainly are very supportive of seeing that rolled out around the world. We know most ports have their own sort of platforms and methods of communicating at the moment, but we would hope over time that more and more ports will adopt this IMO framework so that around the world we can have one common means of communicating information about the ships, which I think is going to become even more important if we're operating these just-in-time arrival schemes. So we need to have everyone access to these platforms and a common way of sharing information so that ship owners aren't having to use lots of different methods and platforms to get that information out. So again, it's just a push by BIMCO to promote this common standard in the industry. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Grant, for that run through on the two clauses. You managed to get a lot of information out in only 5 minutes then. Congratulations. It's a good job I've recorded this for all the journalists to go through all of that again, but no doubt they'll have a lot of questions for you. So we're going to move into the discussion and debate section of this now. We've got about 45 minutes for us now, and this is where, as journalists, we can just fire questions at them, but to keep it fairly organised, you need to go through me a little bit. You can put your comments into chat and I'll ask you then to open up your microphones, or you can wave at me. So if you could turn on your turn on your webcams now, please, if you want to. You don't have to. But if you do turn on your webcams, I can see you wave at me as we go through this discussion as we are moving forward. I've got a couple of questions of my own, of course, and I'll kick off there until I see people start waving at me or sending messages to tell me to shut up. But the one thing that I wanted to ask Grant, in relation to these clauses, how often has the just-in-time clause been used? Have you got any data about how popular that clause is and how well it's being used, or any particular market sectors that are tending to use it? You did some of the challenges with the bulk sector, but what can you tell us about how that clause is being used?
Well, in actual fact, Craig, it's a relatively new clause. We only published it a few weeks ago, so it'll be a little premature to see too much activity on that. But what I can say is that, we have received a tremendous amount of interest in the clause from a number of companies who have written to say that, this is a good initiative on the part of BIMCO. They would like to investigate just-in-time arrival schemes more, and they do appreciate that there is a need for some contractual solution here. So we're seeing a good degree of enthusiasm. And certainly when we developed the clause, we worked with our own members who had already put in place a just-in-time arrival scheme that was in the LNG trade, but they had worked together with their business partners. And so the clause kind of reflects very much what they found to be a commercial solution. So, we work from real life on this. It's not just some sort of theoretical contractual solution. It is very much based on the experience of people who have successfully implemented a just-in-time arrival scheme.
And when it comes to the other clause that you're currently developing at the moment, when do you expect that to be finished? And have you seen a lot with the companies that you're developing? How's that? What kind of organisations are you having to get involved in that?
Sorry, are you still talking about the just-in-time arrival scheme or the port call?
No, the other one, port call clause.
Yeah, no, we haven't actually published that. It's something I'm meaning to do this week. And the reason we sort of separated the publication of it was because I wanted to sort of build on the publicity that we got from issuing the just-in-time arrival scheme and carry it on as a theme, that people can pick up and say, well, this is sort of a follow-on on just-in-time arrival. So it's not out there yet, but I mean, it's a clause that, it's essentially pushing the IMO system of their model framework for exchanging data. So again, it depends on very much on sort of ports around the world also implementing that. So we're just going to raising awareness of the whole thing and hopefully encouraging the industry and the ports infrastructure around the world to adopt this framework as well, so that the ship owners can also use it.
Okay. Frank, I've got a question here from Michael Meyer. Michael, do you want to ask this question or do you want me to read it out? Thumbs up if you want me to read it out, or just unmute yourself to ask the question.
No problem. I can pose myself too, of course. Frank, just a short question. You must have a lot of experience with the work with port authorities from your job. What we hear is that there are still a lot of regions where port authorities are sometimes not really set up, be it technology or in terms of staff, to implement more collaboration systems or more data exchange. Therefore, my question is, aren't bureaucracy and a lack of infrastructure too big an obstacle for this kind of cooperation?
Yeah, so I don't think the lack of an infrastructure is actually an obstacle. That's something that can fairly easily be put in place. And as an example, we have our world of ports application. So if you're dealing in maybe an underdeveloped port where you don't have the ability to capture or publicize information, we could make, for instance, our platform available to that, and there exist other platforms as well to do that. What, however, is a major obstacle is the bureaucracy. And bear in mind, across the world, you have private, you have public, and you have semi-public ports. Within the port, you might have different arrangements for how the terminals are managed. And there is a huge diverging kind of interest there. So in some, to be honest, I mean, in some less developed locations, there isn't an interest or any kind of incentive to operate the port in the most optimal way. There might be more incentives to certain terminal operators, for instance, to give favorable conditions to certain parties. That is a major obstacle, and that's something that will, it's not something that's solved in a day or in a year. It'll take decades to solve that, but incremental steps can be taken. And the most powerful people in driving that change is the ship owner and the operator, and also the charter, of course. But if you have a major owner operator who says, well, this is how we do it, this is how we want things done, the ports will listen, because that's their main important customer.
Good, thank you. And I think Ian's got a question. Ian Cochrane.
Can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
hear me? Yeah, okay. About 10 years ago, I attended an OCIM presentation at the EU about a system which is very similar to JIT called virtual arrival. Now, I think Torm was involved in that as well, as part of OCIM. The trouble is that the charterers did not buy into it at the time, so it failed. Have you got any ideas on if the charterers are going to buy into this?
Yeah, I think I'm sure Andreas might have something to say about that. But my initial comment to that is that parties like BIMCO is incredibly important here, right? Because what we hear from, and I mean, as an agent, we handle some 100,000 port calls a year, and we've done that for many decades. So the amount of information that we sit on is just staggering, right? Unfortunately, there are a lot of parties that engage with us that say that you are not allowed to use that information. And we say, well, we can anonymize it. No one will know it's your vessel, but we can give information about port performance, about seasonalities. I mean, any kind of information we can bring transparency to. But there is still this probably somewhat misguided, maybe a little bit conservative attitude that I don't want anyone to have access to my information, even if it's anonymous, because if I allow that, I feel I'm losing a competitive edge. And that kind of, I think it's misguided. Maybe it's justified. I'll leave that to others to comment on. But if you can remove that obstacle or remove that incentive of keeping things secret, then you've basically cracked the issue. And I think that the BIMCO clauses and the close collaboration, I mean, we have a fantastic relationship with Torm, and we've really, through mutual discussion, solved a lot of these issues. And there is concerns, we look at it, and then we find ways to mitigate that concerns, and we move on. But it comes back to collaboration. If you really want transparency, you have to collaborate. You can't say that I'm being transparent and then saying that I'm transparent only in the things I choose to be, because the rest I'm keeping secret. That doesn't work.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask Andreas to touch in on there?
Yeah.
And I think Grant was waving his hand well, but Andreas.
No, it's a lovely observation from Ian that you know for the past 10, 20, 30 years, you know, there's been this thing in the industry about virtual arrival, right? I mean, and I think for everybody, the concept is so simple in theory, and it's been so hard to implement, and it hasn't really successfully been implemented, at least in our part of the business. What we see in our dialogue with our clients, they are also maturing, and that is accelerating. I mean, we see a number of our significant clients now coming to us requesting and requiring that we report on emissions on their specific voyages. And we're happy to do so. I mean, we do believe in transparency a lot more now than we did in the past. We're not afraid of sharing that information with our clients. What we do is that we'd like to automate it, because we have the information already in our BI structure. So what we do when clients come to us and ask for this, we automate it and we send it to them at the end of the voyage. And I think once our clients, they start to get their head around the data they receive from multiple ship owners, they will also start to see the potential in virtual arrival or just-in-time arrival, which in essence is the same, right? So, I think when we reach that tipping point between that, it's actually can add values on the GSG strategy, and also add value or not compromise the earnings of either the ship owner or the client, then things will start to happen. The dialogue we have so far with some of our bigger clients is that they also understand the concept, and within their organizations, they also have to get their head around it, right? So I think in some of the larger organizations with our clients, they also have different entities that depend on each other. So there's also that element which is complicated on their side. So, but I think now is the right time, and I'm happy to see that the clause is now there also to support it, because that gives something that we can talk together about. So.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Can I just ask Grant to come in then, and then Ben?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I think when it comes to virtual arrival, yes, it sounds a bit like haven't we been here before? But I think the virtual arrival initiative, which we came from BP Shipping, it was very much driven by sort of a commercial imperative. It was about sort of saving money on demurrage. I think nowadays we have a very different agenda, because we're driven by the sort of greenhouse gas issue as well. There are many more different pressures on ship owners. And I think it's a different environment now. So, I mean, I think virtual arrival, yes, it was a good idea, but just at the wrong time. And I think we did learn a lot from that experience, even though it wasn't successful. Certainly in terms of, the whole thing was made much more complex than it needed to be. A lot of the parties couldn't actually agree on what these benefits would be, or how do you even assess what the saving in time was. So it actually gave rise to sort of conflicts rather than helping things. I think nowadays we have a sort of lot of technology and sensors that will make all of this information more readily available and easier for the parties to sit down and agree on. So I just think the timing now is much, much better for this concept of just-in-time arrival, and I would hope on that basis that all of us working together, we can make it successful this time.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Can I go to Ben? I think, Ben, you were waving your hand a second ago.
That's correct. And when drafting such clauses, it is important to understand which data in the business process is business to business, or business to government, or government to business. Just to give you a very simple example, we as a port authority, we can always publish the requested time of arrival at the port of boarding place, because it's a public area, it's a public responsibility, so that's not a problem. However, the requested time of arrival at the berth is in the private domain. Most terminals are private terminals. So that is business to business data. So, of course, the berth planning dictates the part of boarding planning. So it was also in our port community a discussion: can we publish the berth planning, or can we publish only the part of boarding planning, or both? And the one leads to the other. But again, it's a matter of how do you share data and at what time? Because also the timing is important. The berth planning may be commercially sensitive 2-3 days before arrival, because then it can have an impact on the price of the goods on board. Or you publish it only 2-3 hours before the actual event, and then the data is not commercially sensitive anymore. So all those learnings are important to understand when you make an agreement within a port. And of course, we as a port authority are not a part of the charter party, which is only between owner and charterer. But this kind of understanding is important, how to organize your data in a port community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. I've got a question here from Nick Edstrom, and then I'll get Greg Jalal. Nick, would you like me to read your question, or do you want to read your question out? Just thumbs up if you want me to read it out, it's fine. Okay. Nick's got a question for Grant here. Given the importance of charterers in the dry bulk sector, what has the reaction of major charterers been to the proposed just-in-time clause? Will it require existing long-term contracts to be amended? And he puts in brackets, given the importance of China for the bauxite, iron ore and coal trade. So what's been the reaction from the charterers, Grant? And do you consider that they'll be changed to existing long-term contracts that they may have?
Well, first of all, in terms of long-term contract, yes, you would need to make an amendment. You would need to include this provision in there if that's what you want to do. But we've got to come back to the fact that, you know, both parties need to want to buy into this. We're not imposing something on the industry. What we want them to realise is that there are benefits to them from using this particular scheme for just-in-time arrivals. So it's a case of persuading parties that there is going to be a benefit to them. Now, for the owners, yes, we can see, well, you can identify your fuel savings, perhaps as a very obvious one indeed. Sometimes persuading charterers may be more of a challenge for them. I mean, I can give you examples where I can certainly see some major charterers thinking, well, I don't really want to do that. I mean, if they're planning, if it's an oil cargo, to use the ship for floating storage in the port, they're not really interested in just-in-time arrival. So there will always be a commercial aspect to this that certainly for the time being, I don't expect the sort of just-in-time arrival thing to work for absolutely everyone. I think we do need a kind of change in the general sort of mindset, the way we contract at the moment. And then in some ways we have charter parties where the owner, if the ship is delayed, he's sort of, the charter has bought a certain amount of time for the ship to be loaded or discharged, and after that period of time, then the owner has to be compensated with liquidated damages that we call demurrage. And so this kind of mindset that, you're almost being rewarded for being delayed, and we want to turn that around and say that these incentives and benefits should come at a different point. There shouldn't be a reward for being delayed. There should be an incentive for getting out and turning around the port as fast as possible. So there is work to be done with bigger charterers. We do have to persuade them that there are benefits to be achieved here. But it is a case of the parties sitting down during the negotiations and saying, is this work for us on a sort of business-to-business relationship? Can we get some benefit out of this scheme? But I think in the backs of the minds, a lot of these very big charterers, the major charterers, there is the climate change aspect to this as well. We see initiatives like the Sea Cargo Charter, where charterers are now saying, well, we want to openly report on our use of carbon emissions. What is our carbon footprint from using shipping as a transportation means? So if the bigger charterers are thinking along these lines, then this is another tool that can help them address that aspect if they do want to sort of reduce their carbon footprint by using shipping transportation services. So yes, I would see, that's a very long-winded answer, I would see in the future that there should be an interest from the major charterers, yes.
Thank you very much, Grant. Craig, you had a very similar question to that. Do you have anything you want to follow up on that in any way?
No, yes, indeed, it was a very similar question, and I think it's been adequately answered there. And it is an interesting aspect, because you have companies like Cargometrics that have built their whole model is on second guessing the arrival of cargoes in order to be able to trade on the local stock exchange and make marginal gains. So that's that kind of answers that question. I wanted to ask then about to Tom about ESG, which is the latest buzz stroke pressure point on shipping, and you mentioned ESG at the end there. So I just wanted to understand a little bit. So would you see this initiative as a way of showing your ESG credentials to investors and showing the transparency as a way of differentiating TORM from other companies? Is there leverage to be made for the ESG story?
Well, I mean, if we become successful with our customers on just-in-time arrival, it would naturally go into one element of the ESG, and ourselves, we've recently released our ESG material So I think naturally we would connect it that way around. But I think it goes more into, for us, into also now this strategic element towards a greener future, right? Because I mean, it is an obvious place where you can reduce consumption and do good on your emissions and reduce your emissions. And if you can come to an agreement with your clients on this, you know, you can do it in a you know, cost neutral way. I mean, I understand there are other elements and others play on a vessel's arrival in different ways, so it's not necessarily that easy. And I guess that's also why it hasn't been implemented widely in our part of the business. But what we do see with our clients is also environment, ESG, call it what you will, is coming higher on their agenda. And Sea Cargo Charter, for instance, is one alliance where our customers are coming together and starting to focus on this. And that's actually some of the members of Sea Cargo Charter that we are also in dialogue with on this.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. A question I've got for possibly for Frank first, but then maybe Andreas and Ben as well. When you're talking about having just-in-time arrival, I've seen that phrase used quite a lot with logistic firms in terms of just-in-time logistics to minimize stock, for example. But one of the things that became apparent when there was in the delivery was it created a backlog and it created challenges in lack of supply. When it comes, so when you talk about just-in-time arrival, when you talk about port call collaboration, Frank, you mentioned about one port having the ability to get the information to the next port, so that there is that open. But how do you build a sort of a buffer, a flexibility for those unforeseen, because they always happen, those unforeseen challenges? A vessel can't get out of port at the time that there is bad weather, there is something, it has to stop because there is a rescue that it have to undertake or something like that. So there are a lot of ways that a voyage can be influenced. So how do you envisage that implementing a just-in-time environment and a port collaboration environment? And the second question that which I think is more probably Ben's active, is when you're talking about the multiple players that have to be working together to be collaborative in a port call, would there be a pecking order of who gets to be the priority? So if there are two entities in a port call that are, one's available for that ship in the morning and one's available in the afternoon, would you then have a pecking order on who's going to be, whether that ship comes into the berth in the morning or in the afternoon? So flexibility, just in time for the unforeseen, and a kind of pecking order or decisions on how that collaboration works when you've got companies that may well not agree on when they want a vessel in.
Yeah, so if I start there, I mean, you raise an incredibly difficult question, right? And if you ask how can you arrange this in a way to take height for issues such as a COVID-19 pandemic, kind of, let's take PPE as an example, right? But that's impossible. I can't think of any way you can do that, and that comes back to kind of national stockpiling and so on, which is kind of, I feel, outside the scope of this. When it comes to normal trading, that information is available. It's extremely predictable. You can look at historical data and you can more or less predict what will happen. You can also create models. So, right, kind of cold winter northern hemisphere. Well, that's what happened with fuel supply. Look at Japan on the LNG side. I mean, it wasn't a surprise. It was one of two scenarios, right? Cold winter or not cold winter. I think what is more interesting is when you start taking these data and analyzing it and sharing the results, you will see clear patterns of when you have congestion, and that's relatively predictable. And I think that's at the point where you need to start looking at, well, typically in this seasonality for this kind of product, there is congestion in these and these ports. Well, then how do you plan that slightly differently to avoid that congestion and allow kind of a smoother? I mean, no one wants a congested port, right? That's no one's gaining on that. So I think it's about, barring the pandemic or major acts of God or wars, right, which is hard to predict, general trading, general consumption, it's completely possible to forecast that with sufficient accuracy to plan the trading. The inherent conflict of interest is that there's a lot of parties making money on getting to the crunch time and the squeeze time and speculating in this. And that will always go on, but I think we can slightly start mitigating it. And I think some of the things BIMCO are working on is the right things. You can't force this on everyone, but you can encourage it, and you can, to some level of degree, incentivize it. And sorry, I'm talking a lot. I'll soon hand over to Ben, but one of the most encouraging things we see now is a shift in the attitude of the commodity traders, who had almost as bad a reputation as ship agents in being kind of ruthless. But we now start seeing the environmental responsibility, also the social and corporate governance. Things are changing, and it's moving in the right direction, and I find that really encouraging.
Good, thank you. Ben?
Yeah, I agree with Frank that indeed we see things moving now, so that's indeed encouraging. But taking the example within the port community, we as a public port authority, we cannot grant priority to one party over the other. We have to treat everybody in an equal fashion. However, if we recognize the importance of just-in-time arrivals on the environment, but also on safety, then of course we can grant priority to those terminals that allow ships to arrive just in time, or depending on the type of trade, a lookalike of just in time. So for example, container ships, they have a margin, a buffer, so to speak, of 1 or 2 hours flexibility. Because indeed, last minute, you can have weavers that are stuck in the container vessel, or the winches, the mooring winches don't render the line, whatever. There may always be a last minute reason for delay on departure, stopping the other ship to come in. And for tankers and bulkers, as a port authority, we may say just-in-time arrivals means that you have the flexibility to arrive 24 or 48 hours before the requested time of arrival at the berth, allowing you to do tank inspection, cargo inspections, whatever. So the flexibility, the buffer that is out there to allow your operations to happen is trade specific. And then giving priority to those terminals that allow ships to arrive just in time, again trade specific, is something we can make happen as a port authority, because it's based on a public interest of safety and environment. So that's very important. And indeed, we also need to grant them access to the public platform in the port, which is normally a port community system or lookalike, that the terminal can update its own planning, its own berthing position, because that is indeed important to have real-time access to their berth planning to facilitate that planning. So I hope that answers your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I've got a question from Richard Clayton. Richard, would you like to ask the question?
Yeah, I can ask this question. It's a question from Andreas at Torm. Andreas, on one of your slides, you talked about behavioral optimization. Can you just unpack that? What does it mean in the context of just-in-time arrival?
Very good question, Richard. So it was, it's part of a sort of from a general context, but if you link it to just-in-time arrival, you can say if you have more flexibility around your arrival in port, you also have more options in terms of optimizing your route planning. And these days, route planning is one of the elements that is a lot of focus on, hyped maybe by some, but it is actually one of the existing places from a ship owner's point of view where you can still gain quite a lot by working with route planning more sophisticated. You have the weather element, you have current element, and that together with the energy needed to propel your vessel, you can and the flexibility in the arrival in port, you can play with those elements. So I think that's where that will come into context. And then you can say the behavioral element of the people having the dialogue and agreeing on the principles of just in time, right? I mean, you need also to drive the front end staff to have this right dialogue with their counterpart, right? I think that's at least effective. Of course, with the management to support it, right? Which we see, and which we see not only from our clients from the oil major side, but also from the trading side, which is quite positive.
Thank you.
Good, thank you very much, Andreas. I've got a kind of follow-on question to that, but not to Andreas, more towards Grant, because we've seen that at the IMO they're developing the short-term measures, which includes the EEXI. And one of the areas that I've seen discussed by class society and industry pundits has been that one of the quickest ways that a ship and the other part, the carbon intensity angle, one of the key ways that ships are going to meet their requirements under the short-term measures, or these immediate measures, I should say, is to reduce speed. How do you see the influence of EEXI on the just-in-time arrival clause? Do you see any correlation? Do you think this would help increase the use of the clause, or would it make that clause a little bit more redundant?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm afraid your voice was a little distorted there. I didn't really get all of that. I've picked out a couple of key words, and one of them that makes my ears prick up every single time is the carbon intensity.
Grant, could you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me? I don't know, it looks like people can hear me. It might just be Craig that has the issue.
We can hear you fine, Grant. I think it's Craig who has.
It is Craig. Okay, right. I will just carry on talking as if you can hear me there. Yeah, I mean, I picked up you was asking this question about the sort of EEXI and the carbon intensity indicator. The carbon intensity indicator is something that is going to be a big challenge for us in the shipping industry.
Yeah, try again. There must be a poor connection somewhere. No, I can.
I don't know, I got the impression that everyone could hear me. They can't, everyone's nodding. So yeah, okay, we've got lots of thumbs up. So we'll carry on again. Yeah, so the carbon intensity indicator, and yes, that is going to be a really big challenge for ship owners in the future. And because we're not yet entirely clear how this legislation will pan out, it's due to come into force, I think, 2023 or so, but people need to think about it now coming into long-term charter parties. And the big challenge it does present is this concept of continuous improvement in order to retain certain grading of your ship A, B, or C, or whatever. And that, how do you attain this continuous improvement? You can do it by slowing down. You can do it by reducing the amount of cargo you take on board. None of these are necessarily strictly good commercial solutions, especially cutting out cargo. But year in, year out, somehow you need to constantly improve your performance in order to maintain your rating. How this fits in with just-in-time, then, yes, initially there would be a benefit if you adopt a just-in-time scheme, but unless things continue to improve, you aren't going to be able to maintain your rating. So this is a challenge we face. We don't know how charterers will work with owners in order to implement the scheme and make it work in practice. So yes, just-in-time plays a role in all of this, but I think is probably a much larger issue to try to deal with than just the implementation of just-in-time. But just-in-time, yes, part and parcel of it has a role to play. Is a basic answer.
Good. Well, you got the right gist of what my question was then, Grant.
Good. Okay. Good.
Yeah, I don't know what happened then. There must have been a bit of a hiccup in my signal briefly for that, which is why I stopped streaming my screen so that I'd minimize any kind of additional disruption. If anybody else has got any questions, we've got a couple of minutes left, about 8 minutes left here. So if you've got any questions you wish to ask, then please feel free to give me a wave. And Craig, over to you again, please.
Thank you. So this is to the panel generally. Just-in-time arrival sounds like low-hanging fruit route to GHG. Should it be prescriptive? Is this on the EU to-do list, or should it be?
If I can have a go at that, then that's a challenging question to answer, right?
Oh, sorry, Frank.
Can you hear me, Craig?
Yes, I can. Yes, thank you.
Good. Yeah. No, it's a very challenging question, and I need to be very careful how to answer it because it's somewhat loaded, right? But take the example of emission zones. Very unpopular when they were introduced, but no one really thinks about it any longer. So if you get into European or California emission zones, you know what to do. There's a cost associated with it. You include that in the contract, and no one thinks anymore about it. Could you do the same with just-in-time arrival? I think you can in certain areas. It's probably not something you can do globally, but in certain areas, the EU, Scandinavia, certain major ports, it is absolutely viable to do so. But I'm sure Ben will have add a lot of reasons why it's not as simple as it might sound, because within the port you then have many different private terminals, and how do you mandate all of that? But I think Ben is quite eager to add his comments to this as well. But in short, my answer to you is tentatively yes, but it needs to be investigated a little bit more closely before giving a definitive answer.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, indeed, Frank, thank you. Indeed, this is, as you said, a somewhat loaded question. Certainly, you are sort of hesitant to give the European Commission the room to make some things mandatory. However, if we take the Port of Newcastle, for example, in Australia, for them it was quite easy to implement just-in-time arrivals after an incident happened, the Pasha Bulker, who grounded at the beaches. And the national authority told the port authority to implement just-in-time arrivals to make the anchorages more safe, which was sort of easy thing to do. It's an isolated port. It is one trade. It was a sort of a restricted number of stakeholders. However, in the Port of Rotterdam, if we impose just-in-time arrivals as a port, and therefore it is more easy to do business in the Port of Antwerp, then, which is only 6 hours sailing away, then it becomes more difficult. So then indeed it would help if there was a sort of international implementation, not necessarily European, but international. So it becomes more easy for harbor masters to make things moving without ending up in political local discussions, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Frank.
Yeah, I think it's slightly unrelated. It's a bit of a tangent. But if there's one thing that I think should be put into legislation is it's the statement of fact and what information should be made publicly available from the statement of fact. As Inchcape, we have our standard template for statement of fact. No one likes it. No one uses it. Everybody wants to use their own template. And I kid you not, that we have more than 2,000 various templates for statement of fact, I'm sure. I think this is one very low-hanging fruit where you can implement a standard type of statement of fact. And yes, you would have to have certain modifications and so on for different trades, but that's easy enough to do. And it's also easy enough to compile that information and make the non-kind of commercial confidential information available. And you can then start analyzing and you can start looking. And I promise you, what you would find and what you would discover if you started analyzing all the statement of facts across the world, that would be an eye-opener for very, very many people.
Okay.
Good. Thank you very much, everybody. Does anybody else have any additional questions for the panel before we close? This is your last chance, unless you arrange to have the one-to-ones that Christina was talking about earlier on. I don't see anybody waving their hands, and I don't see any more messages coming in on the chat function. So on behalf of the panelists, thank you to the journalists. On behalf of the journalists, thank you to the panel. And thank you, everybody. The show has been recorded, as I'm sure you heard mentioned by that beautiful electronic voice that was not Christina Dupree-Roos at the time, but there she is now. So Christina, any closing remarks from you?
No, I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating. And again, if anybody wants to follow up with any of the panelists and have a one-to-one, then just get in touch with me and I'll arrange that. So, but otherwise, thank you all very much. It was really interesting.
Good, thank you very much. And I get you're going to send out the presentation as well, aren't you, Christina?
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll send the slide deck and the recording. Yeah.
Good.
And if there's if you need anything else like high resolution pictures or anything, then also ask me and we'll arrange that as well. Okay.
Wonderful. Good. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.